Hello, I'm Jill at engVid, and today's lesson is going to be about a poem. Um, and you may have seen some of my videos before about poems. This time it's a little bit different because we're lucky enough to have the actual poet with us who wrote the poem. So that's really nice. And also, just to mention that the poem is a Scottish poem, and the poet is a Scottish poet. So Scottish people have a different accent. Which you may have heard before, but don't worry if you find the accent a little bit difficult at first to follow. Uh, do keep watching, and you sort of tune your ear to the accent. So don't worry if the poet's accent sounds a bit difficult at first. You'll hopefully get used to it. So uh, we're also going to be hearing a bit, apart from the poem, hearing a bit about the history of Scotland and about two different Scottish languages, Scots and Gaelic, which our guest is going to be telling us all about. So I think now I'd like to introduce you to Hugh. So welcome, Hugh. Hugh Macmillan. Hello,
Hello, hello.
Hugh.
How are you?
Hello. I'm fine, thank you. How are you today?
Not too bad at all, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for being with us. It's great to see you. And Hugh is a Scottish poet, and we will be sharing a couple of links to his website and to his YouTube channel, which you'll be able to have a look at after this video. Um, so I think first, Hugh, perhaps we could start. It may be a very basic question, but for our viewers in other countries who may not be so familiar with the geography over here
Uh,
around the UK, can you sort of explain very simply to viewers in distant countries where is Scotland and how does it relate to the UK and England?
okay, well, Scotland, I'm going to show you a very primitive educational aid here.
Ah,
Scotland, Scotland is the landmass on top here. It's quite large. England is underneath here, and there's another country called Wales, as well as Northern Ireland. So this is called the British Isles. A lot of people who are abroad make the mistake of thinking the whole island landmass is called England, which it isn't, of course. So Scotland, the Scottish border is here. So Scotland is a large country of more than 900 islands in the North Atlantic, and England is our southern neighbour, and a mountainous country, but with large sort of swathes of arable land as well. A reasonably rich country as well, much oil wealth,
mhm.
and has had an independent history, or had an independent history for nearly 1,000 years, until we joined voluntarily with England in the Treaty of Union in 1707, and so became part of the United Kingdom. Up until recently, we didn't have a parliament, but we formed a devolved parliament, and we now have a parliament sitting in Edinburgh, but we are still part of the United Kingdom. So Scotland has a parliament, Wales has a parliament, Northern Ireland has a parliament. The only part, in fact, of the British Isles that doesn't politically exist anymore is England. That's not a joke, that's true.
So that's interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Oh my goodness. And of course, also these four separate countries that make up the United Kingdom. Each country has its own flag, doesn't it? And that flag sort of gets merged together to get the Union Jack flag, the
Yes,
red, white,
the
and blue.
Saltire or St Andrew's Cross of Scotland is part of the Union Jack. The Union Jack was formed from the Irish Cross, St Patrick's Cross, the St George's Cross for England, and the St Andrew's Cross, the Saltire. the blue and white flag. There's a wee one on my wall here. Hold on, I'll shift it around.
There it is. So there's the Scottish flag,
That's the
which
sole triumph.
people might see that. We've been having some, well, football matches from time to time, and there's a Scotland football team, isn't there? There's an England football team, so all the fans will be going round the streets with holding up the Scottish flag, won't they, or wearing it on their clothes or whatever. So,
and the British coat of arms has the lion of England on one side and the unicorn of Scotland on the other side. So the unicorn is Scotland's kind of symbolic animal.
Oh, okay.
But I believe we're the only country in the world that's got a mythical beast as our national animal.
Yes, that's amazing. Wow. Okay, so thank you. That's very helpful to know, and thank you for the map as well. Okay, so I think now I will share my screen and we will have a look at the poem. So this is a short poem written by Hugh called The Spider's Legend of Robert the Bruce. And it was published in a book, as you can see, in 2009, a book called The Spider's Spin on It. So here is the poem, and it's a short narrative poem, which means it's telling a story. So don't worry if you're not quite sure what it's about at first. Don't worry, because some of the words are rather unusual. The ones highlighted in yellow are actually Scottish dialect words, which will be explained. And I've also put explanations on the right-hand side as well. And then some of the other words are spelt in a slightly different way from the usual spelling to kind of suggest the Scottish accent. So don't worry if you don't fully understand the poem the first time around, because we will gradually get the meaning out of it as we go along and as Hugh and I discuss it. So don't worry if it seems a bit difficult to follow at first. Hugh, I wonder if you'd be kind enough to read your poem out loud for us.
Yes, I certainly will. I will first of all take a bit of issue on a couple of things you've said there, which are quite important issues, I think. I mean, you used the word dialect. To say that Scots is a dialect of English is as inaccurate as saying English is a dialect of Scots, because we are sister languages. We have the same roots, but from early medieval times, took different channels, took different routes with our languages. And so in actual fact, Scots is a language, and people, it's a very political thing in Scotland, but we have three languages here. We have English, we have Gaelic, which is spoken up the northwest of Scotland, and we have Scots, which is spoken by, in the last census, 65% of people in Scotland said they spoke a bit of Scots kind of thing. So it's a language in itself, not a dialect. So,
okay,
so the words,
I do apologise.
No, it's totally fine, It's a complete, it's a general sort of misconception, in Scotland itself as well. But we would say that Scots is a language, and some of the words that are here are in actual fact words which we have in common with the English, but which we preserved or changed or have been influenced by Dutch and French words and so on, and is altered. When I read Scots poetry to people down south, sometimes they say that sounds like Middle English. That sounds like the language of Beowulf and so on, and that's true. That's we have these common roots, and these words, in a sense, Scots is a kind of a historically enshrined form of English. So it's a complicated situation, but it's not a dialect. We do have dialect poetry up here, but it's more kind of phonetical writing, phonetical speaking. And we have some very famous poets like Tom Leonard, who spoke Glaswegian and who do Glaswegian poetry, which is kind of phonetical accent dialect poetry. But Scots poets would murder you for saying they were writing or speaking in dialect, because, you know, it is a language. It's a thing for me because my mother was a Gaelic speaker from Morven up the northwest of Scotland. My father's folk were all miners from Ayrshire who spoke Scots. I'm an English-speaking poet mostly, because I remember my mother saying to me, English is the language of the scholar. This is why it's kind of political issue here that Scots and Gaelic has been suppressed in preference to English. And this is really why, there's so much movement towards rediscovering or encouraging Scots in schools and Gaelic in schools and so on. These are our historical languages. This poem, The Spider's Legend of Robert the Bruce, is a kind of hybrid Scots poem. It's there are English words, there are Scots words, and so on. So it's not what I would probably say as a full-on Scots poem. I'm editing just now the works of a Scots language poet called Josie Neal, who's an Ayrshire poet. She's 86 and still lives in Dumfries. And I don't know whether you would indulge me to, after I've read this, maybe later on, to read one of her poems as contrast to this, because that would be a very interesting experience, perhaps you and your students. But anyway, this is a kind of I would say hybrid Scots. It's got Scots words in it. To The Spider's Legend of Robert the Bruce. I got scunnered trying to spin a web for dinner. The stain was o' slastery. I couldn't get a grip. I was half stared by the end, no even a midge to clought. Then a big lugger man come in, raggedy, right dosser, mair hungert looking than me, started eyeing me up. I thought I'm off. Swung like Tarzan out the cave on a thread thick as a wain's wrist. Seemed to cheer him up.
That's lovely. Thank you. That sounds fantastic with your accent. And
it's based on a very famous Scottish historical tale. I don't know if you're going to ask me about what his background.
Yes, please explain. Yes, the story
Robert
behind it.
In the 13th and 14th centuries, the English Plantagenet King Edward I attempted to sort of, his job was to create an English empire in France and in the British Isles, and so claimed the throne of Scotland. So there were these wars called the Wars of Independence, and Robert the Bruce, who was the Scottish king from 1306 onwards, fought against Edward I and his son Edward II. At some point, Bruce was defeated to begin with and was hiding in a cave, so the legend goes, and was about to give up and saw the spider trying to spin a web on the wet side of the cave, and he kept trying. And Bruce, so the story goes, saw this wee spider and said, well, if that spider can make it, if that spider can do it, then we will try again, he said, and then went on to defeat the English. Complete nonsense, of course.
So it's a legend rather than a
legend.
Historical fact.
It's a legend rather than a historical fact. I mean, I think Bruce was saved by the fact that Edward I died of dysentery and his son wasn't quite as good a general. But it's not such a good story, that, is it?
No, it's not. No, I think history is full of legends, like
Let's keep with the spiders.
Yes, so it's an inspiring story because it makes people, it can inspire other people who to try again.
That's the idea.
Don't give up first time. Pick yourself up and try again.
To say it was a hybrid poem, that if it was a proper Scots poem, we wouldn't have the word spider, which is an English word. We would have. There are two Scots words for spider. One is an ettercap, which comes from sort of Middle English, and the other one is a wabster, which I particularly like, a webster, something that works in webs, a wabster.
Yeah. A web maker, I suppose. Wow, amazing. And also Robert the Bruce, for any viewers who may not have heard of him, the film Braveheart. I gather he appears in that. That there's a the character of Robert the Bruce appears in the Braveheart film. That of course Mel Gibson is famous for being William Wallace. But Robert the Bruce is in that film as well. So
Braveheart always causes a great controversy in Scotland because the thing about Scotland is some people inside Scotland really don't really wish us to have an independent history. You know, it's a political issue. History, like language, is a very, very political issue. I loved Braveheart. Scottish people slag Braveheart off because they say it doesn't represent the real history. You know, it has the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and there's not a bridge anywhere in sight. They paint themselves blue, which they never did. They have tartan on, which Wallace, as a Lowlander and Bruce as a Lowlander, would never have worn plaid or tartan. So there's all sorts of historical inaccuracies, which the Scots or some Scots used to rubbish the film. But basically, it was the very first proper film treatment of an issue of Scottish history. You know, and it was tremendously popular in Scotland. I remember when Braveheart premiered in Dundee, and I was in Dundee in the cinema on the first night. I have never known an atmosphere like it. At the end of the film, everybody in the cinema, which was packed, everybody in the cinema was up cheering and howling and shouting and stamping. I've never seen anything like it. And the reason for that is because Scottish history has been quite neglected, you know, in terms of its treatment in the media, in terms of our own schools even. Our own schools in Scotland really haven't taught very much Scottish history till relatively recently. And because we are part of the United Kingdom and part of Britain, the media, the BBC, magazines, newspapers, films, and so on, tend to show English history rather than our history. A very famous journalist called Ludovic Kennedy in Scotland described our relationship with England as like being in bed with an elephant, which actually does sum it up. You know, you talked about football earlier on. If you watch the BBC or ITV coverage of the football, they do mention Scotland, but it's all about England. It's all about, well, 90% of the population of these islands are English, so that is perhaps natural. But, you know, when you're Scottish and in Scotland, you notice these things and you think, this isn't fair. You know, so Braveheart was a great thing. And its historical inaccuracies, were one thing, but its power in representing neglected Scottish history was fantastic. You cannot underrate its impact.
No. So okay, so that's a fantastic background then to the poem. So maybe now we could just go through it line by line, and I've put on the right hand side a few sort of translations, if you like. So Scummet. I think you told me, so I've used the information you've given me previously, meaning fed up, or is it tired? This is the spider speaking, so he got tired trying to spin a web.
It's more kind of fed up. Scunner. It's a bit kind of, it comes, I think, from it's akin to the English word scared in its origin, but it's kind of Middle English as well. It dates from the 14th century. The word scunner, so it's appropriate for this poem, which is set in the 14th century.
Right.
But so, that's the idea. Scunner means to get fed up, and. The next word, trying, which is an apostrophe after it, this is another sort of a point of contention among Scots, is the apostrophe stands for the fact that in English there's a G there, right? But in Scots we would say trying, we wouldn't say trying with a G. And the fact there's an apostrophe there some Scots say, well, that's an apologetic apostrophe. Why are we apologising for not having a G? Because in Scots we don't have Gs, so therefore it should be trying. So if I was writing this poem again nowadays, I wouldn't have an apostrophe there. I would have trying.
Okay. And I should also mention that the interesting thing about the poem is that it's from the spider's point of view, whereas, you know, in literature, usually it's written from the supposedly main character's point of view. So for you to write your poem in the voice of the spider, I think is a really, you know, neat thing to do. It's really.
Well, I called it the spider spinning it, which is, you know, that's clever, isn't it? Spider spinning it. The spider story. Well, it took me 5 years to think that up. Yeah.
Yeah, and spin a web for dinner, because the spider gets its dinner by, you know, insects getting caught on the web. Doesn't it? So that's the idea of spinning a web for dinner, because that's how it catches its food. So that's a nice way of putting it. And so then the stain was our slastery. So the
stain was our slastery. I get an apologetic apostrophe there. Slastery is another word meaning slippery or slick. It could be plaistery. The Scots word for slaster is also plaister. It's the same kind of word in different parts of the country. But the stain was all slastery or plaistery, meaning slippery or slick or slidey.
Mm-hmm. So that would make it harder to get the cobweb to stick. To stay.
It's a very onomatopoeic language, so you have a lot of words which suggest the meaning just by you know its spelling.
Yes. So the onomatopoeic language making a sort of sound effect.
Yeah.
Slippery, slastery. It sounds like something slipping, doesn't it? So.
Well, English is the same, of course. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the next line, Scots for I is ah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So okay. And couldn't is couldn't, as I've put there. So he couldn't get it to stick. And okay, let's carry on to the next line. So half starved, half meaning now what would that mean, half starved?
Half starved means just half starved, you know, hungry.
Okay.
Again, the ed in Scots is a T mostly. So, you know, if I was writing this properly in Scots, it would be I was half starved, STAIRVT. So instead of ed, we have T.
Okay.
Again, that's a going back to Middle English, I think.
Okay. Yes. Okay. And then the next line.
No, even a midge to clouth. Clouth is it's like the English word clutch. So it's a Scotch version of that. So not even a midge. You know what midges are. Anybody who's visited Scotland knows what a wee midge is.
Very, very tiny insect, isn't it?
Any insect that bites you to death, strips your skin off. Yeah.
Oh no, horrible.
No, I'm only joking there, but you know, well, actually, not completely joking there. But anyway, so clouth means to clutch. Yeah.
Okay, lovely. And then the moment when Robert the Bruce walks in to the cave.
He comes in, so a big lug o' a mon, right? So a lug is kind of like a figure of a man, comes in, yeah, raggedy, it's right, ragged.
Yeah, so his clothes are ragged. He's got sort of poor clothes on, damp, sort of ripped and torn, perhaps from the battle or something.
If we're saying right, it says, if we're doing that properly in Scots, it'd be recht. Rather than right. Okay. Dosser's not actually a Scottish word. That is the one word in this poem that is a slang dialect word. Dosser's Glasgow dialect for a.
Yes.
Well, I don't think don't think it's just in Glasgow, is it? I think in the North of England they use that word as well.
Oh, yes, I hear it used, dossa, in England, for someone who, I mean, it's to do with sort of sleeping rough.
Yeah, that's right.
Dossing down means to lie down and sleep, but in a rather rough way. So yes, definitely, I think we hear it in England as well.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the next line.
So mare's more, hungert, hungry, looking than me.
So
Stairtet. Again, that would be, if I was writing that properly, the next line, if we're starting stairtet, it should be stairtet or stairtet. Yeah, with the T rather than ED. Iron me. That shouldn't be there shouldn't be a G there. Iron me up.
Okay.
Then the next line, I thought, that should be thocht if I was writing that properly in Scots.
Okay.
I'm off.
I'm
that
off,
should be
meaning
off.
I'm going
Yep.
away.
I'm away.
From here. Yes.
Yep. Swung like Tarzan. Everybody knows who Tarzan is, eh?
Hopefully.
Swung like
the films.
Tarzan. Yep. Out the cave, out of the cave. Own, that should be ON, a thread.
So
Thick as a wain's rest.
A thread of the cobweb. Thread, yes.
And a wain, I don't know whether that's an English word as well, but a wain's a Scots for child. So thick as a child's wrist.
So very thin wrist.
Yeah. And then the next line should be seamed. That should be right, because all EDs in Scots are T to cheer them up. So it seemed to cheer them up. So it's a hybrid poem. So I'm taking the mickey a wee bit. And from the point of view of the spider's quite glad to escape the clutches of Robert the Bruce.
That's really funny at the end, because to say it's sort of very lightweight, isn't it? It seemed to cheer him up. And the other side of the legend from Robert the Bruce is that it was such an inspiring experience watching the spider that it won him a kingdom, a really big thing. But just to the spider, it seemed to cheer him up, very sort of dismissive in a way. So that's really funny. I like that. It's a great ending to the poem there. So okay. So I think we'll come back to that and hear it again a bit later. But I think if we just come back to just having a chat about it and about writing in a sort of Scottish style in general. So I guess quite a lot of Scottish poets write in a style like this, or in their own sort of form.
I still think the majority of Scots poets write in English. There are Scots language poets, and there are vehicles for Scots language poetry, and there's big government encouragement now for Scots language writing. I think in actual fact you can now take Scots as a qualification in school. Now, Gaelic, obviously, there's always been the capacity to take that in school, and now we have Gaelic language teaching, so that in actual fact in schools in Glasgow and further north, you get all your subjects taught in Gaelic. Right, so Gaelic is the language medium for the entire school, and I think Scots language activists would like the same thing to happen in terms of Scots. That Scots would be the medium for education, and that Scots, you wouldn't just get qualifications in Scots in school; you would get your entire education in Scots.
Oh, okay, interesting.
But to do that, there's a big. I'm maybe giving you more detail than you need here. But there's a big controversy in Scotland just now about standardisation of Scots, right? About having an authoritative dictionary, because how can you teach Scots in school if there are 10 ways of spelling, it was. I mean, so you need, but that's a sort of current controversy. But there is definitely big movements in government to try and encourage Scots, and Gaelic, of course, which is a dying language. Scots is a kind of minority well, Scots, probably most people would admit to speaking bits of Scots, and so therefore, it's got something going for it. But Gaelic is in need of preservation more than Scots is, I would say.
Okay, so obviously Scotland has very much its own style and identity and so on.
Well, I think you'll know you'll know there's big sort of movement in Scotland to become independent. So, although perhaps it's deadlocked just now between those who want independence and those who don't want independence. But part of the sort of fight for independence really is to do with identity, and identity is kind of wrapped up in language. Once upon a time when I was younger, it was enough to, if people asked you, what does it mean to be Scottish? All you could answer was, well, it's not being English. That was the definition. But now, people are looking for linguistic reasons, for linguistic identity. We're Scots because we speak a different language, or we speak two different languages, So that's the political impetus behind all these movements.
Yes. So after all these years, since 1707, that Scotland's been part of the UK, but maybe half the population of Scotland could vote for independence, and the other half could vote against independence. But
I think currently it's kind of divide. It's a 50-50 divide. But when we had the last referendum in 2014, when we went into that referendum, something like 22% of people supported independence, and at the end of it, it was 43%. So activists for independence would say, if we were able to present the case properly in a second referendum, then we would almost certainly win. I don't know whether that's the case. Certainly, young people in Scotland are, by all accounts, much more in favour of independence. It's the kind of over 60s who are trenchantly against it. And the older you get, the more against it you are, sort of thing. I think it's people who lived in that post-war sort of time. If you were born in the 1940s, 50s, and so on, then you do have a better sense of Britishness, I think, than young Scots today. I think young Scots today would like to have a crack at being a independent little country full of, a little social democratic country in the north of Europe. We would like to have a go at it. Not that I'm young.
So
I'm an exception. I'm an older person who completely wants independence.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I guess it's a case of whether a second referendum will be allowed, because the UK government is supposed to be the one that either allows it or not. So as you say, it's at a bit of things are stuck at the moment where Scotland want another referendum, but the UK.
Well, I think the longer that the UK government or the longer the British government says things like "you're not allowed," the more support goes on to the independence movement.
Yes, absolutely. So maybe we could talk a little bit about kind of popular references to Scotland. Things that some of our viewers may be familiar with, like another film which was based on a book, a film called Trainspotting. Which maybe gives a rather, because it's about drug taking and drug addicts, it's a rather depressing, perhaps, view of, but it's settings in Scotland, and I think some viewers may have seen it because it's been such a popular film. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that film.
Well, we do have vibrant contemporary literature. We do have some great urban writers like Irvine Welsh, who wrote Trainspotting, Alan Warner, Duncan MacLean. We have, the recent Booker Prize winner Shuggie Bain, and so on. We do have vibrant urban sort of writers. So, and we do have immense poverty in our inner city areas, very much like you would have in the Midlands of England as well, for that matter. And so Trainspotting was it was an extremely funny film, I thought, but it was a no holds barred representation of sort of drug culture in Leith and other parts of Edinburgh. It was set in Edinburgh. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, we are represented, I think, abroad as a country of heather and mountains and whiskey and so on. But we're a modern urban country with modern urban problems.
Absolutely. So yes, and also I think visually, I think something like this sort of what's called the tartan pattern. This is a red and black one, but they come in different colours, don't they? But they're very distinctive. That you've got lines going in both directions like this. So this is a Scottish. I guess it's a Scottish tartan,
It's
not just a
invented by
made-up one.
it's
Sorry.
invented by Walter Scott, the tartan. It's another kind of sort of English invention, tartan.
Oh, so it's an
We
English
have,
invention. It's not even
well, we do.
Scottish then.
Well, in the 19th century, Scotland, I- just to give another little bit of background, I don't know, I'm probably talking too much and giving you too much kind of detail, but we joined up with England in 1707 in the Treaty of Union. The Scottish Parliament voted itself out of existence, but it was a time when very few people had the vote. I think something like 8% of the people of Scotland had the vote at that time. It was only rich people had the vote. But anyway, we had this thing called the Jacobite Rebellion, which many folk will know about. Bonnie Prince Charlie is one of the iconic figures of Scottish history. And the Jacobite Rebellion was to restore the Stuart monarchy, but it was also one of the strands of it was to abolish the Treaty of Union. And Bonnie Prince Charlie wanted to become king of Scotland and king of England, like his Stuart forebears had done. In other words, have two separate countries with him as king of both of them. Now, the Jacobite Rebellion was a failure, and at the Battle of Culloden, the Jacobites were crushed. And after that, you had a campaign of near genocide in the Highlands, where, and it's not just the English to blame for this, it was Lowland Scots who were Protestant, whereas the Highland Scots were Catholic. We had a campaign to crush the Highland way of life. And we had, after that, massive depopulation from the Highlands, emigration to the New World. So people in Canada and New Zealand and Australia who have Scottish forebears will possibly have these ancestors because of what happened after the Jacobite Rebellion. And when you go up north, you will see scattered walls, homesteads, empty villages, and so on. Even where I live in the southwest of Scotland, there were 5 times as many people in 1600 live here then as they do now. So depopulation is the kind of Scottish story, and it was politically and economically motivated. People wanted to get rid of the Highland clan system because it was politically inconvenient, but they also wanted a way of making money out of land, sort of thing. So anyway, so then in the 19th century, having had 100 years or so of being part of the British Isles or part of the United Kingdom, suddenly this kind of Highland way of life was romanticised. And Walter Scott and people like that reinvented the idea of Scottishness. Now, it's Walter Scott's anniversary this year, so there's a big thing in Scotland about Walter Scott, a great Scottish writer and somebody who wrote and used the strands of Scottish history to invent stories and so on. A great writer. But he kind of reinvented this idea of the savage Gael, the Northern Highlander, the heroic sort of Highland. And King George was invited by Walter Scott up to Edinburgh. And he's a descendant, of course, of the Hanoverian kings who conducted this campaign of genocide. But then, this is a reinvention of Scottishness. And if you're a posh Scot, then you would start wearing the tartan. The kilt was never worn in Scotland. It was invented in the 19th century by these posh Scots who were
So
looking at
the kilt,
their,
which is like a skirt that men
yeah,
wear.
nobody wore that. Nobody wore that in Scottish history. I mean, they did wear a kind of blanket which they wrapped round themselves and would use to sleep in and things like that. But it was never tartan. Tartan's an invention
Oh,
of
wow.
the 19th century posh Scot and English. So there was this massive reinvention of Scottish of the Highland Gael. Now they were crushed. Now they were destroyed. They could reinvent them as great heroic figures, and people started going their holidays there and so on. Queen Victoria got her place at Balmoral, and all this kind of stuff.
Mm.
It's part. It's kind of like classic classic behaviour of people who conquered folk, to the people that had been conquered,
Yes.
to patronise them. Sorry, I'm
Right.
coming across as very radical here, haven't I? I'm not really,
Oh,
I'm not
well,
really like
no, it's all
not really
very
like that at all.
interesting. Very interesting. And also, I think you've given us some very useful links for people to look at if they'd like to find out more about Scotland. So
Aye, certainly.
we'll be giving our viewers the links to Electric Scotland and Hidden Scotland and something about literature, Scottish
Aye,
literature. So thank you very much for
no
those
bother, no bother.
recommended links. That's great. Okay, so that's all fascinating, and I just wanted to check with you, Hugh, something from earlier that you were talking about two different languages, the Scots language and the Gaelic. I wonder if you could say a little bit more. And I gather Gaelic, it's like the Irish word Gaelic, only in Scotland you pronounce it Gaelic, but
Yeah.
it is spelled Gaelic, just as in Ireland. So can you just give us a very brief summary of what the Gaelic language is and
Well,
how it developed?
I said earlier on that Scots and English were kind of sister languages, but Gaelic's a completely different language altogether. I mean, before the Roman occupation of Britain, nearly all of the British Isles, Britain's a Roman word, Britannia, the whole of the British Isles spoke Celtic languages. And in the south, and in the south of Scotland for that matter as well, people spoke Brythonic languages, Welsh basically. I live very close to a place called Carlaveric, which is a Welsh word. Carlisle's a Welsh word. We're surrounded by Welsh words down here in the south of Scotland, as well as Norse words, as well as English words, and as well as Gaelic words. Dumfries, where I'm close to, is a Gaelic word. So we have all these influences from different cultures and so on. But, once upon a time, most of the people in Scotland, as in most of the people of England, spoke a form of Welsh. Now, when the Romans invaded and went away again, then various different tribes came into both Scotland and England. And the major invasion in the south was from Germany, from the Anglo-Saxons speaking Anglish or speaking English. And they chased out all the Brythonic Welsh-speaking people, and some residue of them went into what we now call Wales, which is why it's called Wales, why Welsh people speak Welsh, because that is where, that is the sort of fugitive place for Welsh tribes in the south. And these Anglo-Saxons came into Scotland too. And also from Ireland came Gaelic-speaking Scots, right? And they settled in the west of Scotland and the north of Scotland, and they brought with them Gaelic. So we had, after the Romans went away, basically a situation in Scotland where we had Welsh speakers in the south of Scotland, Gaelic speakers in the north and west of Scotland, English speakers in the southeast of Scotland, and in the north of Scotland, these are people that your students won't have heard about, the Picts, these fascinating sort of people who predated all these other folk. Picti, which is Latin for painted people. You know how in Braveheart Mel Gibson's got his face painted blue and white?
Mm.
That would never have happened in the Middle Ages, but the Picts were meant to have tattooed themselves or painted themselves in woad or blue and so on. So Scotland's this amazing sort of strange medley of different sorts of cultures and so on. And the Welsh speakers in Scotland disappeared or merged with the Gaelic speakers. The Picts vanished altogether, a great historical mystery what happened to them. But they didn't have a written language, although they had beautiful sort of carved stones which they left all over Scotland, until eventually we only had Gaelic and Scots as the two languages in Scotland. And Gaelic remained up in the north and the west of Scotland, whereas Scots, became the linguistically important language in Scotland. Although they spoke Gaelic in the court of Scotland, the kings of Scotland spoke Gaelic until the 14th, 15th century, was still the court language, with French, but then eventually became sort of Scots.
Okay, wow. So that's a really
Anyway, I'm here all week.
No, but that's what language is like, isn't it? It's all to do with the movements of people and from place to place and things getting merged. And
yeah, but we're always boasting that we're a mongrel nation because we basically come from 5 different cultures, with Norse as well. I mean, I've got a mountain close to me called Criffel, Crow Mountain in Norse. We have that kind of great sort of heritage of being an amalgam of places, whereas the English, they're just English.
Oh, well,
they're just Anglo-Saxon with a bit of Viking.
Yes, well, even in England, we've got this sort of dividing line between where the Vikings invaded, but it goes part way down the country, but the southern part, it's slightly different. So, I think it happens in a lot of different places, all these
the Danes, they were more born than the Norwegian Vikings. We had the Norwegian Vikings, they were better.
Ah, okay. So, well, that's fascinating. Thank you for that. And so I think it would be rather nice now, I think, if we go back to the poem, and it would be lovely now that we understand so much more, me included, about the background to this poem and the background to the languages in it. It would be lovely to hear you read it again, and we can just enjoy the story and understand what's happening this time. So over to you again.
Okay, Spider's Legend of Robert the Bruce. I got scunnered trying to spin a web for dinner. The stain was all slistery. I couldn't get a grip. I was half stared by the end, no even a midge to cloucht. Then a big lugger mon came in, raggedy, right dosser. Mere hunger looking on me, started eyeing me up. I thought I'm off, swung like Tarzan out the cave on a thread thick as a Wayne's wrist. Seemed to cheer him up.
Lovely. Thank you very much. That's fantastic.
Can I do that? I know you're maybe not going to include that, but can I do it for your own interest? Can I read this Josie Neal poem to show you what a proper full-on Scots poem is like?
Please. Yes, okay. Lovely. Thank you.
All right, it's called My Father. It's about her father. His hair was like coarse grass where rime had settled. Lines ran in deep shucks to his moo, but the een were skinkling. This is me, held out his arm, made his veins stone out like wire, and this, heaven his heart. He's been gone this 12 months, yet thrice I've seen him trekking by, heed into the wind. The last time he came that near hon, I held my breath. He turned the een on me and smiled, and gaed on till mirk.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Nice,
well,
isn't it?
I got about 15% of that, but interesting, lovely. It sounds
she writes in the Ayrshire Scots. It's like Gaelic. Like Gaelic is kind of associated in a sense with a culture that was dying. The rural sort of land in the northwest. Likewise, in rural Ayrshire and in mining Ayrshire and so on, that Scots is associated with a culture that's also, I'm afraid, died out. Whether it's the mines closing or whether it's through the land use changing and so on. So it's like a dying culture as well. But she's a brilliant poet and deserves
Yes.
more to be heard more of. Yeah.
Great. So that's wonderful. Thank you, Hugh. And again, just to mention Hugh's website, do have a look. You'll be able to see this poem and other poems by Hugh on there. And also on Hugh's YouTube channel, where he is hosting a lot of other poets. So you can hear other poets reading their poems on Hugh's YouTube channel. So do have a look at those.
Some Gaelic poets on there too, reading in Gaelic. Some Scots poets reading in Scots, and people from America and New Zealand and all sorts of things.
Lovely. So just a mixture, some Scottish poets and some from other places as well then. So that's great. So that's wonderful, Hugh. It's been lovely and fascinating hearing all about Scotland and Scottish poetry and language and everything. So thank you so much for being here today. Yeah. And thank you to the viewers for being with us and listening and following the poem with us. I hope you've all enjoyed it. So that's it for today on this lesson. So from me and from Hugh, bye for now, and see you again next time. Bye.
Aikaba.